left panel is continuous with and leads to the central one. We will come to see that the central panel shows the temptation of mankind not as a single act between Adam and Eve, but played out in various ways by a whole crew of humanity. We will look first at the background or upper section of this panel. We immediately note that it centres around a square lake, which has at each corner a hybrid tower of vegetable and mineral forms, similar to those depicted at the top of the left panel. In the centre of the lake is a fountain, not dissimilar to that shown in the Garden of Eden. These towers, however, differ in some ways from those on the left panel. For example, the blue colour seen on these towers is not there to indicate distance, but is an integral part of each tower. These are predominantly coral pink and blue. We see how the tower close to us on the left is entirely pink, with only the slightest hint of blue in some veining, while that in the distance on the right has a pink base from which some blue plant shoots emerge. The tower form closest to us on the right has a blue base with some pink leaves set upon it, while that in the distance on the left also has a blue base with some large pink shoots rising from its top. There is an obvious fourfold structure seen here. Each tower stands at the corner of the square lake, from which a stream or river emerges and flows through each tower. At the centre is the Metamorphosed Fountain from the left panel, here primarily blue in colour and more mineral in construction. The plains around the lake teem with life. Animals and human beings are engaged in various activities, some sitting, some standing still, others moving around. Some human figures clamber over the towers or are seen in cave-like entrances at their bases. In the lake itself we see many human figures, some in little boats, others swimming, and some paddling in the shallows. In many places we find people searching for or carrying blue or red fruits. Here a crowd of zitterons, man-knights riding on or fused with a fish body, are carrying blue and red fruits. The towers also entice people to climb to their highest points to find these fruits. On the plain beside the lake, a large group sit around an enormous strawberry, while on the other side of the lake, a similar group struggle to reach a red berry held aloft by a bird. From one of the towers, a flock of birds emerges, as we saw earlier in the tower in the left panel. In the air above, however, it is not just birds that are seen. On the left side, a young man holding a branch from a tree rides on a griffin which holds a toad. They move towards a tower which has a tree branch at its top, and may be intent on constructing or decorating the tower. To their right, a zitteron rides upon a flying fish, similar to the one in the pond in the left panel. He holds a red cherry-like fruit on a string, and as we see a similar fruit hanging from part of the tower, this zitteron may well be intending to add this to the decoration. Similar events appear to be taking place around the rightmost tower. Some most interesting events are taking place on opposite banks of the square lake. On the left we see a large eggshell, one end of which is open. Into this a crowd of 12 or more people are squeezing themselves. This reminds us of the open eggshell in the left panel into which birds were entering. On the other bank, a young man beckons to a group swimming in the lake and encourages them to come to a flat stone which he has placed like a little landing place or jetty. In the lake itself, various couples are connecting with each other in different ways. Some reach out to one another, some embrace, others kiss. A man walks with his arm affectionately over his partner's shoulder. Let us now look at the fountain set in the centre. This relates closely in form to the fountain on the left panel. Both have the lower part as a spherical form with a circular opening. On top of this is an inverted lunar shape on which rises a tower with three vertical components, the side of which two forms rise up, terminating in globes. In the left panel, these seem primarily composed of living plant tissue, while the fountain in the central panel is more mineralized, seemingly of agate or other marble-patterned stone or glass. In both fountains, the top section rises from a flat circular plate, again having a central vertical shaft, plant stem in the left panel, and polished opaque blue stone in the central one. It seems as if the fountain, formerly in the Garden of Eden, has metamorphosed from a hybrid of plant and minerals to one composed entirely of polished translucent stones. In the fountain in the Garden of Eden, we saw an owl gazing out from the hole in its lower sphere. Here in the central panel, the hole is at water level, forming a kind of cave. Within this cave we see a number of people. The two at the front are a couple, like those we saw in the water of the lake, but here there is a more explicit sexual touching. People who don't look closely at Bosch's painting often say that the central panel is a depiction of a wild orgiastic scene, but this is perhaps the only explicit sexual contact depicted in the painting. The background level of the central panel centres around the fountain in the square lake, at the corners of which four reddish pink and blue towers rise up, constructed of plant and mineral forms. The human figures are often seeking red or blue fruits, but there is little indication of them actually eating these fruits. Other humans interact with animals, riding them or carrying them on twigs. Groups of humans gather together in the plains and work cooperatively on some task. In the lake itself, some humans bond as couples. The middle ground of the central panel is essentially very simple in structure. It is centred in a circular pond around which process a cavalcade of riders on various animals. The pond would appear only to contain women. These are gathered into three main groups, one towards the back with 4 women, another with 12, and one towards the front right with 7. There are 4 who keep their own company, and 3 couples. Some seem absorbed in conversation with one another, while others gaze out at the wild circling riders. At the left end of the pond, 2 black women, one with a peacock on her head and the other swimming in the water, are presenting red fruits, possibly cherries, to other women. Some have placed these on their heads. The group of women in the centre of the pond have white birds, spoonbills and herons on their heads, while further to the right, the group of 7 women have blackbirds, possibly jackdaws, on their heads, with one blackbird flying and seeming about to perch. Almost all the women look like the Eve figure from the left panel. Around this pond, a group of about 96 young men ride various animals in a counterclockwise direction. They form themselves into about 12 groups, and while this may be suggestive of an astrological association, there is nothing to indicate this in the various items they carry or the animals on which they ride. None of them bear any fruit on their heads, though many carry red or blue fruits. Many have birds perching on their heads. The three groups of riders at the bottom centre have some interesting connections. In the leftmost, a bird seems to be carrying a large fruit above the head of one of the men. In the central group we see one man with a white egg on his head. We've already noticed that this is the exact centre point of the centre panel. In the group to the right of this, a man holds up a fruit so that birds can feed on it. These three groups are framed by two animals without human riders. A white goat on the left, which carries two spoonbills, and a pink pig with two cranes on the right. Most of the riders are mounted on horses, there being about 35 of these. Then there are panthers, bears, a griffin, two unicorn-like creatures, a camel, a dromedary, two stags, goats, pigs, and other species of animal. Some of the riders carry items, but there are no weapons to be seen here. For the most part, they ignore the women and seem to be conversing amongst their fellows. There is, however, a party of 7 young men on the leftmost group who stare at the women in the pond and are apparently amazed at what they are seeing. Because of the way the picture is structured, being unable to stretch the circular pond and cavalcade of riders to fill the space available, Bosch is left with 2 areas on the right and left. On the left he shows us a bird sitting in the husk of a large blue fruit. This is being carried by a number of men, some standing on their hands and using their feet to move the bird. One young man steers this group by pulling on the long beak of the bird and leads this to join the circling cavalcade. On the right, a similar scene is being enacted. Here the youths have acquired the hollow carapace of a scorpion-like creature. 3 clamber inside, while a further 10 or so lift and propel it forward to join the cavalcade. One on top pulls down upon the tail form, keeping it in a spring-like shape. Back in the side area on the left, we see other activities. A group of 10 or so young men sit on the ground and look on. In front of them is a section of the husk of a large melon or other fruit. One youth crawls inside and seems to be propelling it towards the procession. From its top a branch rises. On one side are 8 red fruits, while from the other a young man hangs upside down. We will see this echoed by a figure on the right. In the space on the right, a group of 10 or so young men kneel down in a circle with their heads towards the centre. They support another who stands upside down with his legs held up, holding aloft what at first sight would appear to be a mermaid. However, if we look at this figure closely, it seems to be male. Also in this space, a group of young men appear, one holding a stick with a red fruit on its end, which a lizard is climbing towards. Behind is a giant flower, in which a host of young men sit and watch what is going on. In the hill below them, another group carry a strawberry-like fruit. In a cave under the blue-based tower, we find a troop of monkeys. These are, of course, entirely detached from the surrounding action. Bosch creates a polarised opposite here at the base of the tower on the other side. From under the pink tower on the left, instead of a troop of monkeys, a party of young men mounted on horses are about to join the circling cavalcade. It is clear that, in this middle ground of the central panel, the women and men are separated. Women in the central pond, and the men a little distance off, circling around it. They do not seem to interact. Indeed, only a few women look out onto the male cavalcade, and most of the riders in the cavalcade are too involved interacting with their fellow riders to pay any attention to the women. Some red and blue fruits are being gathered or displayed, but no humans are seen eating them, but only a few birds peck at fruits. We now come to consider the lower part of this panel, with its many enigmatic scenes. The foreground of the central panel is divided off from the middle part by a dense hedge of trees and shrubs. For the most part, the inhabitants of this lower area seem unaware of what is going on above them, except for two figures. One on the left riding on the head of a bird, and the other huddled with two others under a transparent flower canopy. We can immediately see that the foreground has two main areas: a triangular lake on the left and the grassy ground which rises to the right. In each of these parts, many complex scenes are depicted by Bosch. These are difficult to grasp individually, but we will see the ways in which they are linked together. Let us first look at this triangular lake. We see it has two main areas: a furthermost part in which giant birds and humans interact, and a frontmost area in which four scenes are set in a linear row. The procession of 9 birds is led by a goldfinch, which holds a stalk with a reddish-purple berry to feed 3 men. These crane their necks back like chicks in the nest, gaping for food. Behind this is a robin-like bird, then a woodpecker, a hoopoe, a goose, and a crested lark in the rear. These are being ridden by young men, in much the same way as they rode the horses and other mammals in the cavalcade in the middle ground, making extravagant gestures and having leaves or transparent gourd-like forms on their heads. Other men are seen walking amongst the giant birds. In front of this group, a mallard skims across the water. On its back a kingfisher perches, and a couple, a white male and a black female, reach out to one another affectionately and are about to kiss. In front of the mallard, an owl sits incongruously in the water and is being embraced by a young man. He seems to be looking directly at us as viewers, attempting to engage our attention. At the front of the goldfinch that is feeding men as chicks, a couple holds each other somewhat awkwardly. The male also appears to look directly at us, appealing for our attention. Immediately to the right of them, a man in a barrel-like husk floats forlornly, seemingly cut off from the action around him. At the front of the lake, 4 little scenes are set in a row. In the topmost, we see a coral-coloured calabash or gourd-like fruit, which has been hollowed out, floating on the water. This is similar to that which formed the base of the fountain on the left panel. Inside this are an Adam and Eve, similar to the rather awkward couple to the left. They look out from a large tear in its side. The head of a stork peers out behind them, and the leaves of various plants also grow out from here. A fruit emerges from lower down, the hollowed fruit. From its angle it obviously does not belong to the couple, so there is another human within this floating fruit. This figure at the bottom of the structure may relate to the man in the barrel-like husk. The male or Adam-like figure is holding the stem of a large berried blue fruit, somewhat like a bramble. 11 young men, swimming in the water, gather round it and eat its berries. Further down, a young man floats inverted in the water, his body and legs forming a Y shape. Held between his thighs is a large red fruit. It has a gash in its side. Like the large round fruit above, out of this emerge the leaves of a plant and an ibis-like bird. A thorn penetrates the fruit. The inverted young man holds his hands to protect his genitals against the thorns. Many people, only glancing at this image, say it indicates masturbation, but this is not what is depicted. This is clearly a protective gesture. Note the way he even crosses his thumbs. In the front of this row is a double structure. The lower part is a hollowed-out calabash or melon-like form, very similar to that forming the base of the fountain on the left panel, and indeed closely related to the form at the other end of this row. Inside it we see a man peering out from a circular aperture which has a glass tube inserted in it. Bosch amusingly places a rat here, looking back at the human figure inside. From the back of the spherical hollow fruit, a stem of pink and white leaves emerges and terminates in a large spherical flower. This has blue sepals, and the bluish globe of the flower is transparent, allowing us to see a courting couple inside. They embrace in a tentative way. The female is almost adopting the Adam posture we noted earlier, but here her right hand is placed on his thigh, not her own. His hand gently rests on her belly. We can see these two forms to be compositionally related. The first image can be seen as metamorphosing into the second, through it growing a bluish flower within which the couple then reside, leaving the lower pink coral section to the man peering out. This figure must relate to the person whose foot emerges from the lower part of the first image, and may also connect with the man floating in the barrel-like husk. Many interpretations have been made of this globe-like flower, some even seeing it as a womb. But these are reading something external into the depiction. All we can say is that they seem related through the similarity of their forms. It may be that there is a narrative worked out pictorially in the events on the lake. At the back, a number of large birds interact with the humans and ultimately feed them with fruits. In the foreground, the birds do not dominate, but the ones that appear are on a more naturalistic scale. Here the humans, particularly the Adam and Eve figures, enter into the body of the fruits themselves and make a home there. Adam and Eve feed some young men with a large berry. One figure inverts himself and seems to be rejecting the red fruit. There appears to be a linear narrative about the relationship of birds, humans and fruits, leading from the top left along the arc of the lake down to the lower left. We will find other narratives worked out pictorially in this lower section of the central panel. We can see that the foreground is essentially a triangular expanse of grassy meadow that rises, forming a small hill at the right of centre, which then falls away into a background area. At the three vertices of this triangle, important scenes are depicted. At the top right, a group of 6 figures, seemingly 3 couples, are in a grove of trees. One man presents a large strawberry to a seated woman, while beside her another woman is in the act of eating a red apple or cherry-like fruit. Another young man on the ground beside her reaches up to pick another fruit from the tree above him. To the right, a man stands and picks another fruit, while behind, a woman sits on the ground, somewhat removed from these actions. On the lower left point of this triangular area, another group of 6 figures stand. Again, these would appear to be 3 couples. In the front, a man stands looking into the garden on the left panel, pointing out the scenario to his companion. This black woman also gazes at the scene. She has a cherry or red apple fruit on her head and holds another behind her back in her left hand, almost surreptitiously. A plant, possibly a 5-lobed pansy, grows out from between her thighs. Behind them are 2 male and female figures. They are giving their attention to the frontmost couple, almost as if waiting for a cue what to do. The man on the left holds a large orange-coloured fruit with blue leaf-like markings. At the bottom right point of the triangular space, there is a little cave at the base of the ridge of the small hill. In this cave we see 3 people. A man looks out from inside the cave directly at us, almost as if he's attempting to attract our attention, and to further emphasize this, also points to the woman in front of him. She is placed behind a semi-cylindrical glass shield. The glass appears to be made up from circular pieces, each with a central pontil mark. This was a style of crown glass invented in the 14th century. This woman holds a red fruit in her right hand, and on the ground beside her lies another yellow-orange fruit. What is very significant is that she is unable to eat the fruit, as her mouth is sealed closed. These scenes show the 3 ways in which humankind can react to the temptation of eating the fruit. The group in the top left corner seem to have entirely given themselves up to indulgence in the fruit. The man at the bottom left is in the process of making a decision. He sees into the Garden of Eden before the fall and seems animated and attracted to that state, but his companions on either side try to tempt him. When looking at the pond in the middle ground above, we saw a similar black woman offering red fruit. Here she holds one behind her back, ready to tempt the man. The group in the cave have made their decision not to partake of the fruit, and the woman is shielded behind glass and has her mouth sealed. A parallel has been drawn to the birds on the left of the cave. Here we see a marble column with a glass globe on top. One bird is sealed off within this globe, while the other is free outside. The glass globe also has pontil marks to emphasize the parallel with the woman in the cave. The background area lying behind the little hill and just under the group eating fruits from the trees, lies closest to the right or hill panel. On this little meadowland we see two merrymakers dancing back to back, their heads and upper bodies within a large pink fruit. They hold red fruits in their hands, and have other red fruits and three-lobed blue flowers festooned about their bodies. On top of the fruit sits a large owl. Below them another young man plays with a red fruit lying on his back and teasing and enticing a blue bird to eat of the fruit. This group on the little meadow closest to the right panel seem to have partaken of the fruit and are entirely at ease with it, happily playing. On the hill to the left of this scene there is a high point overlooking the meadow. On the top of this a woman lies beside a young man whose head is inside or has become transformed into a large blue fruit. They lie together, apparently discussing the scene on the meadow. She gestures to this with her right hand, and he places a comforting arm around her shoulders. He may be trying to convince her that she should also eat of the fruit, so that then she can join in the happy play of those on the meadow. Also on top of this mound, further back, three figures stand under a hemispherical transparent flower, similar to that in which the two figures were courting one another in the structure on the triangular lake. We have already noted how the leftmost figure gazes up in astonishment at the cavalcade around the pond in the middle ground above him. The other two under the canopy are not engaged by this, but instead attend to one another. One is a young man, while the other may be an older woman. She wears a cloak or cowl over her head, which goes down to her knees. This little drama should perhaps be seen in connection with the previous image. There the young man seems to be having some success in winning over the younger woman. But by contrast, here the young man seems to be having more of a problem convincing this older woman, and takes her arm in a more robust, cajoling and persuasive gesture. A third group are also seen on top of this mound. These are the three young women kneeling on the grass and pushing their heads into an ornate, hollowed-out fruit or perhaps flower that is set on top of a cylindrical pillar. These three women gaze out at the happenings around and below them. Seen as a totality, the events or little dramas presented on this flat plateau appear connected. They seem to reflect three ways of relating to the temptation to eat the fruit. In one, the young woman appears almost convinced by her fruit-headed partner. In another, the older woman appears more intractable, while the three young women are intensely curious, but as yet untempted. At the base of the ridge of the hill, we see three stony towers. The top left is a red, triangular, coral-like form, hollow inside. Next is a tall, cylindrical, orange-brown form with a door at its front, while on the lower right is a solid bluish-white pillar with a reddish egg stone set on top. Around these three structures, various little dramas are being enacted. Let us begin by looking at the top structure. At first glance, this appears to be a hollowed-out tree, but its red, mineral-like surface instead suggests coral, and its brittleness is suggested by the fact that a small piece of this has broken off and lies at its base. Within it, three figures stand, though we can only see their feet. On top of one of its branches, a jay perches. It holds a red fruit, a cherry or red apple in its beak, and is in the act of feeding it to a large group of 20 or more men and women who act like its chicks, craning their necks and gaping their mouths. We saw a similar scene being enacted in the nearby lake, where a goldfinch acted as the feeder of a trio of young men. The next structure is a kind of gateway leading from an underground cave. In this cave we see 7 figures, possibly all young men. Set in front is this gate, seemingly of a polished stone such as yellow jasper or brownish sardonyx. Through the doorway, 2 men are exiting from the underground space and meet with another outside who carries a fish. These 3 engage in a conversation, and the rearmost gesticulates as if to emphasize a point. In front of this, 2 little dramas are depicted. On the right are an Eve and Adam figure. This is a key scene in this central panel. Eve adopts the pose that Adam took when in the Garden of Eden he was presented with Eve. There, Adam was alert and bright-eyed, but here Eve has her eyes closed. She has a transparent conical flower with blue sepals over her head, and appears cut off from all that is taking place around her. Adam stands behind her, gently touching her arm as if consoling her. He has a berry on his head, indicating that he has been tempted and has eaten the fruit. He appears to be looking towards the black man in the lower group, who gesticulates to him. Eve appears to have been tempted to eat, but not yet been transformed by the fruit, so only a flower is set over her head. On the left, a man bends over, kneeling with his bottom in the air. He gazes directly at us, the viewers. Bosch only shows a small number of figures gazing directly at us, so these are key images. Protruding from his anus are a red and a blue flower. Beside him crouches another young man, holding 2 red flowers. This is often interpreted as some kind of homosexual scene or a depiction of the sin of sodomy. However, this is not certain from the symbolic context. Here this may rather be indicating that the red and blue flowered plants, and by implication the red and blue fruits, are not spiritual and godly, but earthly. These flowers do not appear in the left or Eden panel, nor in the upper and middle sections of the central panel. The source of the flowers is not the divine world, but the world of corruption and decay. Interestingly, this is being shown directly to the Eve figure in this graphic way, but she, like Adam beside her, has partaken of the fruits, and her head is now covered with the flower. Lower down the slope is a solid agate pillar, capped with a blue mussel shell. On top of this stands a polished reddish egg-shaped agate or jasper, with another small egg set atop. This pillar is solid and cannot be entered. In front of it stands a group of 5 figures, 3 men and 2 women. These appear rather knowing. The black man on the left has a red cherry-like fruit on his head, from which trails a stem with blue and red fruits on it. He looks towards the Adam figure and gestures with his finger. In front of him are 2 women with a blue and a red flower in their hair. One has a vine trailing around her like that on the tree in the Garden of Eden. The other stands proud and self-aware, gazing out over the various scenes taking place on the plain below the little hill. The posture of her body is mirrored, as we shall see, in that of another Eve figure in the foreground. This row of 3 towers and the little dramatized scenes around them obviously were conceived together. At the top, the humans are unthinkingly given up to eating the fruit, almost instinctively, like the chicks of birds. They crowd together and struggle with one another for the proffered fruit. Those around the middle tower or gate are more considered. They discuss the matter in their little cave, and those that emerge through the gate seem to carry on the discussion with the man carrying a fish. In front of the gate again we have Adam and Eve, who, having considered the situation, decided in favour of eating the fruits. Those around the lower pillar seem so knowing and confident about the use of the fruit that they seem inclined to encourage others to eat it. On the plain below this ridge, a number of further dramas are being enacted. At the lower right, 3 people are seen with 2 large fruits. Behind, a man whose head is becoming covered by a reddish-purple flower bites into a giant strawberry which he seems intent on keeping to himself. In front, 2 men have found a large fruit whose husk is opened to spill out a pile of small red and blue fruit. One lifts up a red fruit in his left hand and is about to eat it. He almost adopts the Adam posture we have noted in other figures through the painting. This is happening about 1/3 the way in from the right side of the panel. 1/3 the way in from the left side of the panel, a similar scene is taking place. Here, an Adam and Eve couple sit on the ground. The Eve cradles a large gourd in her lap. It contains many small red fruits. She raises one up with her right hand, examining it closely before eating it. Beside her, the Adam figure points to another spherical fruit which they may eat. As in the corresponding scene on the right, there is another figure behind them. Here he drinks from a large blue gourd-like fruit, which another man presents and holds for him. At the centre of the lowest margin of the central panel is a complex scene around a blue barrel-like calabash or gourd. We should note some similarities to the smaller barrel-like husk floating in the pond, within which a man sinks down. Inside this large blue barrel-like form is a young man holding 2 red fruits in his right hand. He cranes his head and opens his mouth to receive a red fruit from a duck. Above this blue barrel-like form are 2 groups of humans. The skin of the gourd are circular cells in which are some blue-lobed flowers, possibly pansies. These are seen throughout this lower part of the panel. That on the left has at its front a young Eve-like figure bearing 2 cherries or other red fruits on her head. She seems rather remote, detached and self-absorbed. Behind her are a group of 6 women and 1 man who seem curious about what is taking place in the barrel. They neither hold fruit nor have them on their heads. We can clearly see a similarity in posture between her and the older woman on the right of the centre panel. To the right, another mixed group of 7 stand behind the blue barrel-like gourd. The front, an Adam figure feeds an Eve with a small red fruit, while others behind him look on curiously. To the right behind them, a young woman holds up a large blue berry. On the left of this group, an animated black man gesticulates to the other group and may be encouraging them, like the other black man on the right side of the panel, to eat the fruit. At the front of the blue barrel-shaped gourd, 2 figures stand on their hands upside down. Their heads and upper bodies are inside flowers or fruit forms. The one on the left has additionally his or her feet pressed into a small pink gourd-like fruit from which blueberries emerge. The figure on the right bends their legs over to support the duck that is feeding the man. Another figure is in the barrel-like form, as we see their hand coming out near its base. This hand reaches out to touch a fish that lies seemingly abandoned on the ground. This fish is very similar to the one held by the man engaged in conversation outside the gateway to the right above. To the left, on the bank of the little triangular lake, we find a number of scenes related in form to those taking place in the lake itself. These are the group of 3 men in the thistle-like plant, the man bearing the mussel shell, the man carrying off a blue fruit, and a group within a pink calabash form. Let us first consider the group at the centre of this foreground part of the central panel. The leaves of a thistle-like plant curl up to create a hollow space within which are 2 figures. Another man lies prostrate on his back, with his arms outstretched, seemingly unconscious. One of the figures, either a man or a woman, it is difficult to say, reaches out from within the plant and grasps the young man's right wrist in exactly the same way as the Christ figure grasped Eve's right wrist. Rising from the base of the plant is a large blue flower with a buff white calyx. This has the same structure as that lying behind the transparent globe with the lovers on the lake. Further down the slope, a man carries off a large mussel. The shell is partly open, so that we see within this a couple lying face to face. The hand of one of the figures appears to be holding the edge of the mussel in order to keep it closed. 2 pearls are seen within the shell. Lower down the lake, we see a man carrying a large berry or perhaps bunch of grapes. In front, there is a large, hollowed-out pink calabash with a round hole at the top. Inside this, a young Eve tenderly reaches up to accept a kiss from an Adam standing outside and bending down to reach her. Lower down in the calabash, we see a man with half his body outside, but who peers out through a circular hole equipped with a glass cylinder. This is like the form in the double structure in the lake, except that there the glass cylinder was open at the end and held a rat, where here the end of the cylinder is closed with some kind of seal. Immediately behind the calabash are a group of 3 young men. One holds a blue-lobed flower, possibly a pansy. One of his companions places his hand on his shoulder in a conciliatory gesture. This man has a large strawberry with a blue flower on his back. Thus we may assume he has already eaten of the fruit and is here encouraging the other to go beyond gathering flowers and partake of the fruit itself. We can see that these 4 little scenes set on the lakeside have some elements in common with those depicted in the figures in the lake itself. The hollowed-out calabash with the lovers and the man peering down a glass tube. The man with the large berry links to the 11 men in the water eating the blue-berried fruit. The lovers and the mussel perhaps linked to those in the transparent flower. And the man lying on his back in front of the curled-up thistle leaves perhaps relates to the inverted man in the pond. The blue tit on the leaf above the prostrate man is also inverted, perhaps to emphasize this point. In the 4 scenes at the front of the lake, we saw two examples of people relating together as couples. Here, on the margin of the lake, we also have two such couples. Let us attempt to summarize something of what is being depicted in this foreground part of the central panel. It seems obvious that Bosch was trying to show us the relationship of humanity to the temptation of eating the fruit. For only in this part of the panel are fruits being eaten. In a series of cameo scenes, he explores the different ways in which humanity responds to the temptation. In some, the people have obviously already taken the fruits, this being indicated by their having fruits or flowers on their heads. Some of these try to encourage the others also to partake. Other scenes appear to show individuals and groups considering this and trying to decide whether to eat the various fruits. Let us examine the scenes where fruits are actually being eaten. There are 9 in all. We can see that different relationships of the humans to the eating of the fruits are being depicted by Bosch. Some are fed fruits by birds and almost instinctively, without thinking, eat these. Others are encouraged to partake by other humans, while some do entirely of their own volition. In places, we see some couples relating together. There are 7 scenes with couples closely relating to one another. Some occur openly, while others are within a large fruit, flower, or even the mussel shell. In one, the couple are merely together in the large fruit. In another, there is only an affectionate touch. Others embrace and seem to lead to a kiss, while in the mussel shell they lie close together. We have already noted how a few of the characters gaze out at us and engage us as viewer with their glance. There are 5 instances where figures in the painting make eye contact with us. Bosch seems to use this device to indicate key moments in the narrative. Adam embracing his Eve in the lake, the man eating the fruit, the man relating to the owl, the man with flowers in his anus, perhaps demonstrating the earthly rather than heavenly source of these flowers, and the man in the cave with the woman behind the glass shield whose mouth is sealed. Although many of the humans relate to one another in a general way, some make an emphatic gesture or point to something Bosch wishes our attention to be drawn towards. In 6 of the 7 cases, the man points with his finger slightly bent. In 4 cases, this gesture is made to someone close to him, as if to draw their attention. In 2 other cases, the individual points to an object, the large fruit, or to another person, the female with the sealed mouth. In the other case, the woman seems to gesture with her open hand towards things that are happening close by. Let us now return to the 2 rather enigmatic scenes where a fish appears. The fish is an early symbol of Christ, dating back to the Roman period, but it continued to be used even in Bosch's time. The first shows a man carrying a fish outside the gateway. He appears to be arguing or discussing matters with 2 other men. We can perhaps come to see this man as a Christ-bearer, just as some people in the painting bear fruits, indicating that they have been tempted. This fish-bearer appears to have some connection to Christ, therefore he is free from temptation. In the second image, the fish lies neglected on the ground, and one of the figures inside the blue barrel-like gourd reaches out and places his hand on it, as if to try and keep a connection to the Christ. Now, having looked at each of the components of the central panel in detail, we see that Bosch is presenting a view of an ongoing process of temptation. He replaces the conventional idea of a single temptation of Adam and Eve by showing all of humanity in the process of becoming tempted. In the top part of this panel, various people are gathering red and blue fruits. These correspond to the 4 towers, which appear to interweave or metamorphose these red and blue colours. In the central area, the sexes are separated and perhaps becoming polarised and aware of each other as opposites. There is, however, no connection being made here between the sexes. In the lower foreground, we see the various ways in which humanity relate to the temptation to eat the fruit and then become attracted to one another and begin to form couples.